recorded, so whatever you're saying is being recorded.
No naughty words, is that what you're telling me?
Well, nothing that you don't want anybody else to hear.
Okay, America in Vietnam. Tonight we're going to talk about a bunch of things. How did it happen? Why did it happen? And to a small degree, what happened, but I'm not going to try to tell you about every this and that and the other. I'm going to give you some highlights. And I may be unfair in doing that, but that's the way we're going to do it. First, let's talk about a recap for those of you who were here last week. Last week, we covered the French colonial era. Indochina had been occupied by the French for almost 100 years. And instead of making it a business interest, they were there for the glory and prestige of France. They did all this with military force. It was an era of exploitation. Because of the way they did it, there was very little middle class in Vietnam. Turmoil came with the Japanese army in the Second World War, and what the French did was collaborate, because the Vichy regime had already agreed with Germany, had made a pact with Germany, so they also included Japan in that pact. Last week, I talked a lot about Ho Chi Minh. He became the savior of his country. Initially, he was a nationalist, then he was a communist, then he was again a nationalist, and ultimately he was a communist again. Franklin Roosevelt hated colonialism. He was opposed to ever letting the French back into Indochina, but he died. Throughout the Second World War, America did not support French interests in Indochina. But our strategy by 1945 was very much unclear and very much affected by what was going on actually back in Europe. As a result, the French returned to Vietnam. Almost immediately, there were incidents between the French and the Viet Minh. They escalated into pitched battle in 1948, and they continued to fight each other for the next 8 years. Through those 8 years, the Viet Minh wore down the French and eventually defeated them at Dien Bien Phu, and I talked a bit about that last week.
George, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Were these like the regular French army? Were this French Foreign Legion? You know, the French army was pretty spent at the end of World War II. Who were they? How did they man these forces?
Everything that I've read said that the best troops the French had were in Vietnam. There were airborne divisions, Foreign Legion units.
Yeah, regiment of Foreign Legion there. Yeah.
They were, everything I've read said that who they had there was first class. They were not occupation kinds of troops. Okay, what was America doing during that first Indochina War? By 1954, America was carrying the cost of the war. France, remember now, was absolutely destitute, and the United States was providing 80% of the cost of the war. There was some American assistance promised when they went to Dien Bien Phu, even some air support, but there were some conversations once Dien Bien Phu had been besieged with Eisenhower. He asked the question, would it really make any difference if we provided air support? He was told no, and so they did not. There also were discussions with the French in which the possible use of nuclear weapons was considered. At one point in time, they talked about using nukes, tactical nukes now, not major Hiroshima-sized bombs. But anyway, it never happened either. Eisenhower got cold feet, to put it mildly. With the capitulation in May of '54 at Dien Bien Phu, the war between France and the Viet Minh was almost over. And I say almost because it lasted another 2 months. During the time they were actually at Dien Bien Phu, there was a conference being held, and they made a division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Control of the north was given to the Viet Minh, and in the south, it became the state of Vietnam under Bao Dai. That agreement was reached to prevent Ho Chi Minh from gaining control of the entire country. Part of the agreement was to schedule a vote for the following year where the people of Vietnam had an opportunity to say what they wanted for the future. That vote never happened. A year later, Bao Dai was deposed by his prime minister, Ngo Dinh Diem. They created the Republic of Vietnam. Who was Diem? Diem was the first president of South Vietnam. He was president for 8 years. He actually grew up in a well-to-do family, worked in the family's rice fields. He then attended the same lycée that produced Ho Chi Minh. He was there for about 20 years after the Second World War. He called for the French to introduce a Vietnamese legislature and then resigned when this was rejected. For 10 years, he lived as a private citizen with his family, although he was kept under surveillance. From the time the Second World War ended until he became prime minister in '55, he had no formal job. He came to the United States around 1950. 51, he had an audience with the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, and part of that audience, Acheson became a very large supporter of Diem. Remember now, Eisenhower is still president. Diem toured Eastern America, and he argued that Vietnam could only be saved for the free world if the US sponsored a government of nationalists. That referendum that I talked about was scheduled for 1955. However, that referendum was just in the South. The North was not included in it. In a rigged election, Diem got 98.2% of the vote, including 200,000 people who weren't even there. Some people would consider that a rigged election.
George, this is Clint. It just looks like a carbon copy of what you described in Korea. Just
Yep.
Absolute perfect all over again.
Absolutely, absolute similarities, but there are differences too. For one thing, we were not in Korea like the French were in Vietnam, a replacement. We were replacements for the Japanese, and they were Asian as opposed to Western. Diem's rule was authoritarian, and 8 years later, he was assassinated. In September of 1950, the first actual American advisory group called MAG, Military Assistance Advisory Group, went to Vietnam, and their role really was to supervise military equipment supporting the French. This commitment would grow and grow and grow. The domino theory argued that if one country fell to communism, then all the surrounding countries would follow. That was developed as policy during Eisenhower's administration. Kennedy, when he was a senator, so this would have been sometime during the Eisenhower administration, said in a speech, all of those countries in Southeastern Asia, including Japan and the Philippines, are among those whose security would be threatened if communism overflowed into Vietnam. So Kennedy was also a believer in the domino theory. In 1954, as Dien Bien Phu was falling, a Saigon military mission was established. It was headed by Edward Lansdale, and it was run by the CIA, not by the military. CIA efforts included sabotage, counterespionage, and propaganda, all in support of Diem. Later, that same CIA, primarily Lucien Conein, was the liaison with the generals in the coup to overthrow Diem. So the CIA worked with Diem for about 6 years. They concluded that Diem was never going to be successful. They turned around and told the American ambassador that what we needed to do was replace Diem. Now, I read this, and I think it's probably fair to assess. It's very hard to figure out what was going on. Programs that were happening were primarily funded by the United States. But on many occasions, Diem was unwilling to do what America wanted him to do with any consistency. It was just a mess. The biggest single thing that people thought that they should do was land reform. That what they should do is redistribute all of these great big foreign properties among the population. That never happened. And I suspect it never happened because Diem was being told by more than one person, you can't do that or else. In 1959, the Viet Cong started agitating for land reform. Now, the term Viet Cong means communist traitor to Vietnam. It was the term that Diem gave to his opponents, whether they were communists or not. The relationship between the Viet Cong, now this is in South Vietnam, and Hanoi was always controversial. The communists insisted that the Viet Cong was an indigenous insurgency. But later, sometime after the war, communist leaders in the North affirmed that Southern Communist forces were strictly under the authority of Hanoi. By 1959, the Cong were creating mischief. However, we had the same problem in Vietnam that we had in China, the problem that we had with Chiang Kai-shek. We were just unwilling to deal with Diem's weaknesses, just as we were unwilling to deal with Chiang's weaknesses. We were, and in fairness, I'm not sure what we could have done differently in the long run. Uprisings also began in the Mekong Delta in 1960. And there, what the Viet Cong did was create something they called liberated zones. In other words, they set up zones where they had Viet Cong government. They told the population, you do not have to pay attention to the government in Saigon. You have to do what we want you to do. You will get your land. You will get various and sundry benefits from it. So by 1960, the Viet Cong were offering a better way of life to a lot of the population. Meanwhile, and I think this is really kind of interesting, in 1960, the United States had a Senate investigation called the Mansfield Report. Mike Mansfield was impressed by how U.S. aid was affecting the situation in Vietnam, and he planned, this report was suggesting that they phase out MAG very soon. Obviously, that didn't happen. Kennedy's policy was based on Diem's being able to defeat the guerrillas on their own. Kennedy was against the deployment of American combat troops. This is something I just threw in here for perspective. John Kennedy, in his graduation address at West Point in 1962, I happened to be there, was, this is another type of war. war by guerrillas, subversives, insurgents, assassins, war by ambush. It requires a new and wholly different kind of military training. Now that's John Kennedy in 1962. So he did not anticipate the kind of war that we got into. I just asked this question rhetorically for fun. Whose independence was gained by effective use of such tactics 175 years earlier? Knowing this, why did we choose to fight a conventional war? And I don't know how to answer that other than that's the only war that the generals knew how to fight. Okay, escalation. Sometime early in his presidency, Kennedy transferred responsibility for paramilitary action from the CIA to the Pentagon. By now, there were 40,000 communist troops in the South, most of whom had actually infiltrated from the North, but a lot were drawn from the South population. By 1962, allegedly, there were 300,000 people enrolled in the Liberation Association, VC, or at least VC supporting. In 1961 and again in 62, troop level, these were almost all military advisors.
George?
Yes.
Do you have any idea what the percentage of Viet Cong there was of the population in
No.
Vietnam?
No, but my sense is that the Viet Cong was primarily South Vietnamese with some level of Viet Minh, call it cadre, call it whatever you want. There were also, pretty soon in the war, there were also North Vietnamese regulars in the South. But this number here was before that happened. By 62, there were 12,000 advisors in Vietnam, and I can remember them coming back to the military academy and giving us talks about what they were doing, how they were supporting the Vietnamese. At the same time, there was very little American effort made to develop trained and armed paramilitary forces. In other words, the people in the hamlets needed to be protected from the VC, and we assumed that the South Vietnamese army was the way to do that. Later on, they had the regional forces and the popular forces, but in the early 60s, they were not there. The Vietnamese military, though, just refused to deal with local issues. They did not see local issues as the threat. They saw North Vietnam as the threat. By 1963, there were 16,000 advisors in Vietnam, starting from the original Eisenhower 685 advisors in 54. The Viet Cong won its first significant military victory against the South Vietnamese at Ap Bac. I don't know if you've ever heard of Ap Bac. In 1963, Ap Bac was a disaster. It was a small-scale battle, but it resulted in the first combat victory by the VC against regular South Vietnamese forces. A VC battalion of 350 was caught in the open by 1,500 South Vietnamese troops. They had helicopters, they had artillery support, but they used their resources very poorly. Not only did the VC get away, but the South Vietnamese took 200 casualties and the VC only took about 60. If you read The Bright Shining Lie by Sheehan, he talks a lot about Ap Bac. Ap Bac was what showed our country that the South Vietnamese army and the whole South Vietnamese organization was not getting it. Diem was not dealing effectively with the communist threat or the non-communist opposition. He had trouble with the Buddhists. His generals turned against him, and they were led by the CIA, and they started a plan for a coup d'etat. Kennedy was frustrated by what was happening. He conceded the war could not be won under Diem's regime. And if you read about how the coup actually happened, most of the people in the White House chose to be away from Washington when it happened. In November, a military coup was authorized, and I say authorized. Cabot Lodge was given authority to do whatever he thought he needed to do, but it resulted in the overthrow and death of Diem and his brother. He had a number of different problems. He was indecisive. In the face of danger, he was immobile, but inefficient as he had been, his successors would be worse. I want to show you a list. This is the list of people who followed Diem. Remember, Diem was there for 8 years. Most of them were generals, and none of them were qualified to lead a country. This is what that list looked like. Starting with Dong Van Minh in 63, ending with Dong Van Minh the 4th time in 75 for a week. These are the various people who were the replacement. Now, Key and Thieu were in the longest. Key was an Air Force general, and Thieu was a regular or a Army general. Really a very sad story. Okay, the next phase. In 1963, there was a meeting held in Hanoi. The discussion was, is it time to send the Viet Minh south or to focus on protracted guerrilla warfare? They chose insurgency in North Vietnam. As a result, the communists geared up for a maximum military effort. Now, this is North Vietnamese troops that we're talking about, but what they did was they increased the army in the north to 300,000 men. 3 weeks later, Kennedy was assassinated, and it became Johnson's War. Most of the significant battles in the Second Indochina War were won by America, or at least we certainly projected that they were won. But defeat of the enemy was a very elusive goal. For the most part, they would not engage in pitched battle. It would have been far more difficult for North Vietnam had they not been backed by China and the Soviet Union. I don't know if they could have done it without them. Probably not. Many factors undermined America's efforts. Firepower and technology in an agrarian jungle mountain environment, and we got to go back and look at the French, was no guarantee for success. The incident. Bill, you were talking about what was the Navy's role. They started something called Op Plan Alpha. And that was over in here. These were Navy ships right off the coast of North Vietnam. They were inserting agent teams into North Vietnam. They were conducting aerial reconnaissance missions. They were conducting electronic surveillance operations. These were destroyers operating very close to the coast of North Vietnam. They led to the Gulf of Tonkin incident. 2 separate incidents involved North Vietnam and the United States. The USS Maddox was on one of these DeSoto missions, It was allegedly engaged by 3 North Vietnamese Navy torpedo boats. I've read both comments that say it never happened to they never got into a fight with them. I've read various and sundry descriptions. But the second incident led to the passage by Congress of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. That gave Johnson the authority to assist any Southeastern Asian country jeopardized by communist aggression. In August of 1964, Operation Pierce Arrow was initiated. 64 strike sorties from the aircraft carriers, and they were now off the coast, out in here, Ticonderoga and Constellation, hit these torpedo boat bases and the oil storage areas. At that time, we lost 2 aircrafts. We also destroyed the storage facility and destroyed or damaged 25 torpedo boats. The first American POW of the war was one of those pilots. 64 ended with 206 Americans killed in action, which was more than had been killed in the first 7 years of our participation in Vietnam. On February 6th of 65, the Cong attacked Pleiku. 8 Americans were killed and 130 wounded. As a result, the U.S. launched Operation Flaming Dart, which was air attacks on North Vietnamese bases. And there are, if you see here, there are these bases here right close to the Gulf of Tonkin. They were not attacking Hanoi or Haiphong or one of the big cities. Escalation of the war officially started January 1st, 65. The 18th Tactical Fighter Squadron from Okinawa deployed to Da Nang Air Base with F-105s. Here's an interesting fact. I didn't realize this. You know who the first troops were that came into South Vietnam? They were the South Korean Army in March of 65. I didn't realize that. In fact, and they were the last out too. In May of 65, the first American combat troops came to Vietnam, the 3rd Marine Regiment. In June, the Battle of Dong Xai was initiated by the VC during their winter-spring offensive, and they were not fighting the Marines, they were fighting ARBAN battalions, and they soundly defeated them. In August, Operation Starlight began. Now these Marines were fighting 5,500 Marines against 2,000 of the 1st VC Regiment. The Marines suffered 250 casualties and killed close to 900 VC. And I don't know about you guys, Jerry and Mike, but sometimes I wonder about the numbers that we give for Viet Cong and Viet Minh casualties. I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about that later. I want to tell you about the journalists.
I think especially early in the war, some of those numbers were suspect.
They stayed suspect, Jerry, as far as I'm concerned. More than any previous war, the Vietnam War was affected by the journalists. As you know, World War II had seen Edward R. Murrow and Ernie Pyle and William Shirer, and they gave the population of the United States a picture of what was going on in the war, but they really were beating the drum to be supportive of what the United States was doing. Political thought, now I'm back to Vietnam, was shaped by Henry Luce and Joseph Alsop, both of whom were big-time publishers. They were part of the development of the domino effect and the Gulf of Tonkin incident resolution. They were beating the drum to get the United States into the war, kind of like Hearst back in the Spanish-American War. Early correspondents like Homer Biggert and Marguerite Higgins started the discourse. One was for the war and the other was opposed. I don't know if you've ever even heard of them, but they were both very well known. Journalism was exemplified by David Halberstam. Halberstam was over there as a young journalist. He was there almost from the beginning. He cast doubt on the narrative from its inception, and if you've read The Best and the Brightest, he was not impressed. Simultaneously, Neil Sheehan wrote A Bright Shining Lie. It's the story of John Paul Vann, and he took the whole life of Vann and used him for a parallel of how our commitment in Vietnam went from initially being supportive of the population and hearts and minds to using mega bombing missions. Sheehan also had a part in the Pentagon Papers. He was the one that worked with, and I don't remember the name of the man that published the Pentagon Papers. I ought to. And then there were the TV journalists, Arnett, Morley Safer, and Walker Cronkite, for instance. They brought the war into our living room. And then last but not least was Bernard Fall. He saw it coming from the very beginning. Fall chronicled the entire French experience. Then he came back with the Americans. And he was on a patrol with an American unit on the street without Joy, which I think is Highway 1, when he was killed. And if you want to read a pretty factual, I'm not sure if I'd call it unbiased, perspective on Vietnam, read Bernard Fall. The dilemma. To that date, no one had demonstrated that a white ground force of any size can win a guerrilla war, which is a civil war between Asians in jungle population with a population who did not want to cooperate with foreign forces. That's the crux of it. How, when you don't have a government, that's the difference between Vietnam, I think, and Korea, Clint. At least in Korea, you did not have an indigenous population in the South who was fighting for the North. Some people were convinced that once we deployed a substantial number of troops, it was going to become a war between the United States and a large part of the population. The French had failed to defeat the Viet Minh with conventional forces, but we tried the same thing. And I think we made a big mistake when we focused on body count. I'm going to talk a little bit more about body count later. This is Lyndon Johnson. We did not choose to be the guardians at the gate, but there is no one else, said Johnson. And he ordered 200,000 American ground troops to Vietnam and another 100,000 if necessary in '65. The next step was inevitable, the Battle of Hai Drang. That was the first major engagement in 1965 between the 1st of the 7th Cav and Pavan. Those were not Viet Cong they were fighting, those were Viet Minh regulars. Bud Alley's 2nd to the 5th Cav Battalion at Landing Zone Albany, almost a part of the same battle, was almost annihilated. And if you read Bud's book, what we did was we papered over that destruction. They did not want to admit that that many Americans had been killed in an ambush, and so they just didn't. 1966, Hai Drang was a blueprint for future tactics by both sides. We used air mobility and artillery fire and close air support. What did the Viet Cong and Minh do? They learned they could neutralize the effectiveness of American power by grabbing them by the belt and avoiding casualties from the artillery in the air. Westmoreland considered the Hai Drang a success, and a policy involved called body count. Every time a unit went into the field, they filled out a situation report, and it would conclude with a body count of enemy killed that specific day. And I can't tell you how many times I saw sit reps that said 1 or 2 or 3 from the 1st Infantry Division. Success in the future would be evaluated by reducing the enemy's strength by attrition, which sounds a lot like World War I. However, the NVA seemed to be willing to endure endless manpower attrition. Americans found the effort politically unsustainable. In September of '66, an operation called Attleboro. Weren't you in Attleboro, Mike?
Yeah, I was there.
You can, if I'm making stuff up, you can tell me. It began as a combat training exercise for the 196th, developed into a widespread battle with 2,200 American and Vietnamese troops involved. It was the largest U.S. operation of the war to that date, but it was a harbinger of what was going to come in '67. They did not engage that many VC or Viet Minh with Attleboro. It was mostly uneventful. Search and destroy sweeps became, I guess I would call it, the standard tactical process that we used. Caches of supplies were discovered, but there was little head-to-head conflict. The enemy refused the offer of combat. '67. By the end of '66, and I was there, I got there in the middle of '66. I think, I can't read my number up here, but I think there were 250 or 300,000 Army troops by the end of '66, plus 60,000 sailors. By then, 6,000 Americans had been killed in '66. 30,000 more were wounded. In January of '67, we began something called Operation Cedar Falls, the largest ground operation of the war. 2 infantry divisions, 30,000 U.S. and South Vietnamese troops. That included the 168th Combat Engineer Battalion. My battalion was part of Cedar Falls. Primarily what we did in Cedar Falls was tunnel rat kinds of things, but we were there, we were in on Cedar Falls. Plan was to destroy the Iron Triangle as a stronghold. Here's a critical point, including deportation of the civilian population of this whole area to New Life villages and destruction of their homes and defoliation. That did not make the people supportive of us. It was labeled a success, but later on, historians have argued that the treatment of the civilians was detrimental to our war effort. We were not winning hearts and minds by taking them away from their homes and putting them into these life villages. In February of '67, there was an air mobile assault. 240 helicopters swept into Tay Ninh province in Operation Junction City. Again, the VC just melted away. And again, my battalion was supporting that operation. And what we did in Junction City, if you've ever heard of a roam plow, that's a bulldozer with a stinger on it. And the idea was jungle clearance with bulldozers. And that was my battalion's contribution to Junction City.
Hey, George,
Yes.
the reason they called it the Rome plow was, I understand, the blade was manufactured in Rome, Georgia.
Correct. And if you ever saw one, it doesn't look like any bulldozer you're accustomed to seeing. It's got something on it called a stinger. It's a mean looking piece of equipment. In the fall of '67, Operation Shenandoah led to an ambush of a 1st Infantry Division battalion. That ambush almost annihilated the battalion. I've been reading a book recently about it called They Walked into Sunlight. It's a book I guess I would encourage you to read. because again, they decided to classify it as a victory, even though they had almost no physical. These were Viet Minh troops, by the way. These were not VC. Even though the body count, the real body count was almost insignificant, they said that there were 150 or over 100 VC counted. The argument was whether or not they were caught in an ambush or not. The people who were there said it sure as hell felt like an ambush, but Westmoreland and the commanding general would not acknowledge that they had been ambushed. Now remember 67, because at the end of 67, Westmoreland told the world that the communists were unable to mount a major offensive. Meanwhile, in 67, communist forces were building for Tet. Tet actually started with the battle at Khe Sanh. The artillery shelled Khe Sanh. Khe Sanh, I believe, is in the northern part of the country. 18 Marines were killed and wounded, and 40 wounded. That attack lasted 2 days, but what we thought was that we should protect Dien Bien Phu, or we should protect Khe Sanh and make out of it a Dien Bien Phu of drawing the Viet Minh into open battle. However, a week later, on the Tet holiday, Viet Cong units surged into action over the length and breadth of Vietnam. More than 100 cities and towns were attacked by 80,000 Viet. What the heck? The initial attack stunned the U.S. forces and took them by surprise. However, most of the attacks were contained and beaten back, inflicting massive casualties on the communist forces. By the end of the battle, by the end of Tet, 37,000 Viet Cong had been killed. Many more had been wounded and captured. The fighting had created 500,000 civilian refugees. For the VC, Tet was a catastrophe. It pretty much destroyed their infrastructure. But for Americans, it was a strategic blow to our public support. It destroyed the myth that the enemy was on the ropes. In 68, American KIAs were 17,000. In June, Westmoreland approved the abandonment and demolition of Khe Sanh, and allegedly the Marines have never forgiven him for sticking them out there, getting them shot at, and then pulling them out. This is what American ground forces looked by 1969. This is what they looked like. If you look at where most of them were, they were along the coast. If you look down the coast, this is where the majority of them were. There were 12 either division level or brigade level units, plus all of the strap hangers in the headquarters. In January of 69, Nixon took office. He promised peace with honor. He promised to negotiate a settlement that would allow American troops to be withdrawn and also allow South Vietnam to survive as an independent country. He initially authorized something called MENU, which was the bombing of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong bases within Cambodia. Over the next 4 years, we dropped 500,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia. In February of 69, NVA assault teams and artillery attacked American bases all over Vietnam. It was another Tet, killing 1,100 Americans. The heaviest fighting was around Saigon, but fights again raged all over South Vietnam. It was pretty obvious that the Vietnamese were not going to quit. As far as this offensive was concerned, artillery and air power eventually overwhelmed the offensive. By 69, American KIAs had exceeded 34,000 men, which was the number killed in the Korean War. 1970. A new policy was initiated during the Nixon years, something called Viet Namization. And what they were doing was increasing the role of the South Vietnamese forces and decreasing the role of Americans. In April of 70, South Vietnamese troops attacked into Cambodia. The objective was to defeat the 40,000 troops of the NVA and the NLF in Cambodia. 2 days later, an American force of 30,000, which included 3 American divisions, also attacked into Cambodia. It lasted 60 days and uncovered huge supply depots. In this battle, there were 10,000 NVA and VC casualties, 450 Americans killed, and 2,200 wounded. ARVN casualties were more than 4,000. Next, there was a battle of fire support base Ripcord. It was a battle between the 101st Airborne and the North Vietnamese in July. It was the last major confrontation between U.S. forces in North Vietnam. They launched a surprise attack on the fire base. During that battle, 250 Americans were killed and more than 1,000 were wounded. NVA losses were in the several thousand level. In 1970, American KIAs were 6,000. 1971, although the drawdown started almost as soon as Nixon took over, as 71 started, there were still 250,000 American troops in Vietnam. Now this I just thought you might be interested in terms of how was this affecting what was going on back in this country. ROTC enrollment had decreased from 190,000 in 1966 to 70,000 by 1971, and it would continue to decrease. The general population in America no longer supported the military. The decline in morale was demonstrated by a battle at a place called Fire Support Base Marianne. A sapper attack inflicted serious losses on the defenders, and Firebase Marianne was a base set up actually to bring artillery support over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So that was what Fire Support Base Marianne was about. The U.S. soldiers in the area had poor security. The attack was successful. In the investigation that followed, charges were brought against 6 officers, including the division commander and the assistant division commander, for dereliction of duty. I was not able to find out what they did other than relieve them of command. Morale was poor by 71. I don't know how you felt, Jerry, but in general, no one wanted to be the last American killed in Vietnam. 72. By January of 72, there were 130,000 American servicemen left in South Vietnam. 2/3 of the troops that had been there had left in the last 2 years. The ground war was now the responsibility of South Vietnam, and the South Vietnamese army had 1 million men in their forces. In April of 72, the NVA seized control of Hue again, but the South Vietnamese held their positions and they launched counterattacks and forced the NVA to withdraw. As a result, Nixon initiated a new bombing campaign called Operation Linebacker. It lasted 12 days and included a 3-day bombing of 120 B-52s. They were not going after the cities, they were going after fighter airfields, transport targets, and supply depots around the cities. In Operation Linebacker, 6 American planes were lost, 93 airmen were killed, captured, or missing. It was the largest heavy bomber strike since the end of the Second World War. Meanwhile, Nixon and Kissinger, who were stalemated with the North Vietnamese leaders, were negotiating with China and the Soviet Union as intermediaries. By the end of the year, U.S. military personnel in South Vietnam was down to 24,000, but 36,000 South Koreans remained. 73 to 75, in January of 73, a ceasefire was signed. All American combat soldiers left Vietnam except for advisors and Marines who were protecting American installations. For the U.S., the war was over. Congress passed something called the Case-Church Amendment. It prohibited any direct U.S. military involvement after the 15th of August of 73. However, at that time, they did say that they would continue military and economic aid until 75. But the end for South Vietnam came very quickly. Most of the ARVN units were actually concentrated around Saigon. And once the breakthrough started in the Central Highlands, the ARVNs just deteriorated. The capture of Saigon by the North Vietnamese in April of 75 marked the end of the Vietnam War. North and South Vietnam were reunited the following year. For the following decade, there have been severe economic disorder in Vietnam, but 45 years after the experience, Vietnam is doing well. The cost: more than 3 million Americans served in the war. More than 58,000 had been killed and over 1,000 missing in action. And I don't know how they classify those missing in action today. Some 150,000 Americans were seriously wounded. In real terms, the United States expended $1 trillion on the effort. The inflation that followed was a harbinger of the economic future of the world. Here's an interesting fact that I looked up. During the war, 31 B-52s were lost, including 10 that were shot down over North Vietnam. Interestingly, I looked up a different sheet that said only 1 was shot down over Vietnam, but I think I believe this part. In 1995, the Vietnamese government, now this is a single government, reported that their military forces suffered 1.1 million dead and 600,000 wounded during the conflict. Civilian deaths were put at 2 million in the North and the South. The U.S. military estimated between 250 and 250 South Vietnamese soldiers died in the war. The legacies of the war. Instead of lessons learned, think about the American experience from the perspective of what following generations have experienced. Trust in American political leaders has never been the same. By learning how much they misled the population, our system was and is mistrusted by our own population. Economic power in the modern world has been shifting towards Asia since this war was concluded. Today, it almost seems unstoppable, as communism once seemed. Vietnam today appears to be a healthy economy, poised for success. And if you go over there and observe what they're doing, they are a very, very energetic culture. The Vietnam Memorial is a somber reminder of that war. I personally cannot hear the familiar thwack thwack of a Huey overhead or in a movie without remembering my experiences there, lest we forget. Any questions? Is there anybody still there? Hello?
Yeah,
Thank you, George. George, that was excellent.
Excellent, George.
hold
Excellent.
on, George.
Very
I had a
good,
question.
George.
A lot of stuff there. Excellent.
I had a question. Why was South Vietnam never recognized by United Nations like South Korea was? South Korea had put a lot of backing into, United Nations had put a lot of backing into South Korea and during the war. And even after the war, they put a lot of development into the South Korean economy, education system and that, but they never did the same with South Vietnam.
I have a guess. I don't know if this is true. If you'll remember, the only reason South Korea was ever accepted was because the Russians were busy boycotting. They did not do that again. So they would not have let it. They would not have let it happen, would be my guess. I don't know.
Russians were boycotting what? The United Nations?
No, the Russians were boycotting the Security Council on the United Nations because of what the Security Council was doing about the China question. So they left. They actually walked out of the United Nations. I think it was at 47 or 48. They stayed gone for quite a while, and while they were gone was when a lot of things that were done about South Korea actually took place.
Yeah. But if there's one comparison of South Korea to South Vietnam, I think that was a big difference. South Korea had more, I think, worldwide support, United Nations support than South Vietnam ever did. The only one that seemed to care about it was US. Everybody else wanted nothing to do with South Vietnam.
There were some people there from Australia. There were Australian troops, New Zealand troops. I think there were some Thai troops. There weren't very. Sito got involved. Do you remember Sito?
Excuse me, who?
I'm sorry.
You're breaking up. I know.
Sito was called the South Treaty Organization.
No,
That's who we brought into the conflict.
yeah, I don't remember that. Okay, but that's really good. Good show tonight.
Yeah.
And for all you guys, next week will be the last show for the season. That's the end of our go-to meetings subscription. So we'll be taking off for 2 months, and maybe by September we'll be back at the library. We hope. So
We can hope.
yeah. So we'll be back. We'll see you next week.
George.
You're welcome, guys.
Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you, George. Very good.
Thanks,
Yeah,
guys.
thank you, George. A lot of good work on there.
Take care, guys.
All right.
You
Adios.
too.
Adios.
Stop the recording.
Okay.